There was one thing Alexander Sterling could never tolerate: a lack of control. He controlled executive boards with a glance. He controlled nine-figure deals with the same calm with which other men ordered coffee. He controlled his schedule, his image, his emotions. The 42 employees orbiting his executive floor, and the thermostat in his office, which was always set to exactly 66 degrees Fahrenheit, because that's how he found it most comfortable to think. What he couldn't control was the nausea. That Tuesday morning, with the New York City sun slanting in through the windows of the 41st floor, Alexander stood at his desk, never sitting when he received the investigator, as if standing gave him some advantage over whatever he was about to hear. And he looked at the brown envelope Rafael Mendez had just placed on the glass, without saying a word. Mendez was good at his job precisely because he didn't speak more than necessary. He'd come in, leave the envelope, wait. If the client wanted to ask something, he'd ask. If not, he'd collect his fee and leave. 12 years working for men like Alexander had taught him that truly wealthy people don't need explanations for what they already know. Alexander opened the envelope. The photos were 4 prints on photographic paper. Crisp. Professional. Mendez. I was meticulous about that. The first. A clear shot at the entrance of a neighborhood grocery store, with a bag that clearly weighed too much for its contents. Her hair was pulled back in a makeshift bun. The kind of bun not made to look good, but to save time. She wore a jacket Alexander recognized immediately because he had been present when she bought it. It was almost 2 years ago at a flea market in the East Village. She had said she loved the created color. He had thought he could buy her 50 better jackets. He hadn't said any of that. The second photo. A clear shot from behind, pushing a stroller down a street with uneven cobblestones. The stroller was modest, practical. The kind of stroller someone buys when they calculate every dollar. The third. A small park. Late autumn afternoon. Yellow leaves on the ground. Low light. Clara was sitting on a bench, the baby in her lap. And that's where the nausea began. Because the baby looked at his mother with that absolute concentration only babies a few months old possess. That way of observing the world as if every single thing was an urgent discovery. And he had Alexander's eyes. It wasn't an impression or a wish to see something that wasn't there. They were his dark, intense eyes, with that slightly almond shape that the Sterling family had always called Grandpa's eyes. His son, on a park bench in a neighborhood park, in last season's clothes, with a mother who calculated every dollar. Alexander placed the photos on the desk, walked to the windows. New York City stretched beneath him in all directions. Ordered. Brilliant. Crisscrossed with arteries he knew by heart because that horizon was, in a way, his. Or at least, he had always felt that way. In that moment, he felt none of that. Have felt his stomach contract with a violence unrelated to breakfast, because there is something profoundly absurd and profoundly human at the same time about owning 4 companies, 3 properties, and a 41-story penthouse, and being paralyzed looking at a blurry photo of a baby in a modest stroller. Wealth cures nothing but poverty. And Alexander Sterling, in that instant, was the poorest man in New York City. Any relevant changes this week? He asked without turning around. The rent, Mendez said with his usual economy of words. She's a month behind. The landlord sent 2 notices. Alexander closed his eyes for 2 seconds. Just 2. Has she asked anyone for help? No one. She has a friend, Lucy, who brings her things occasionally, food, diapers, but she doesn't ask, she gives back what she can. Of course. She does. He thought. Of course. She doesn't ask, she never asked for anything. That was part of what had driven him crazy from the first day. He dismissed Mendez with a gesture, waited for the door to close. Then he sat on the black leather sofa that cost more than the monthly salary of 3 of his employees. He sank his elbows into his knees and stared at the photos from that distance. The 4th photo was the worst. In the 4th photo, the baby was smiling. A toothless smile still. The kind that's more eagerness than anything else. With closed eyes and puffed cheeks and clenched fists, as if smiling were a physical effort that deserved full commitment. Alexander had an identical photo of himself at that age. His mother had shown it to him once in passing, as if it were unimportant. You were impossible even as a child, she had said, without particular affection. In the Sterling family, affection wasn't declared, it was inherited. Like the surname, like the businesses, like the inability to say certain things at the right time. He called his assistant. Cancel the 11 o'clock. The Hong Kong board meeting. Yes, Alexander. They've been waiting 3 weeks for that. Cancel it. A pause. Tell them to wait another week. They know it's worth the wait. He hung up. He looked at the photos again. There was a detail in the park. The photo that he hadn't mentioned to Mendez because it made no sense to mention it. Because it was a detail that existed only for him. Clara on the bench with the somebody baby in her lap. Her face tilted up towards the sun. Eyes closed. And even though it was a stolen photo from 100 feet away, and the lens was a telephoto, and details were lost in the resolution, Alexander could see that in that moment, on that bench in that park, in that autumn, Clara Sterling was smiling. Without him. With little money. With the landlord sending notices. Smiling. That, my dear friends, is what a woman who left out of dignity and not resentment does. She can smile into the sun. A month behind on rent. And a baby in her lap. That kind of strength can't be bought. And Alexander knew it. He had known it for 18 months. That's why the nausea before we continue. And believe me, you'll want to continue. If this story has already touched you, leave a like and subscribe to the Kobzer channel. It's the simplest way to support this corner where we come to feel, sigh, and forget the world for a while. Now, because this is just beginning. Almost 2 years before that Tuesday with the photos and the nausea. And the Thermostat at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Alexander Sterling had walked into a meeting with an interior architect who arrived late. With a wet portfolio under his arm and a coffee in his hand that was evidently not from the kind served in that building. The meeting was not with her. Clara Miller was the architecture firm's assistant. She had gone to deliver the blueprints the architect had forgotten at the office and entered Alexander's office with a large folder. The quick step of someone who already had 3 things pending. And this was the fourth. And an expression that was neither subservient nor shy, but simply efficient. She placed the folder on the meeting table. "These are the plans for level 3, she said, addressing the architect. "You left them on the printer." I told you this morning." The architect mumbled something. Clara was already gathering her things to leave. It was at that moment, the exact instant she turned towards the door, that Alexander said something he had never said in 12 years of business meetings. "Can you stay a moment?" She stopped, looked at him, not with the submissive surprise of someone unexpectedly addressed by an important man. She looked at him with the quick, undramatic assessment of someone who needs to know if this will take up her time or not. "I have another meeting at noon," she said. "It's exitoista. Kak sekumenta. A pause." She didn't blush. But she didn't leave either. She stayed. And here's where I tell you something important. Because people often, I get these stories wrong. Alexander Sterling did not fall in love with Clara Miller because she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Though she was, in that quiet, unostentatious way that is more dangerous than glamour. He was interested in her first because she was the first person in years who I told him she had another meeting when he asked her to stay. In Alexander's 40 years of life, people didn't have another meeting when he spoke. People canceled, whatever it was. Clara Miller had a meeting at noon. And it was real. And she didn't cancel it. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by people who said yes to everything, that was almost a physiological shock. The meeting ended. Clara left punctually. The architect spoke of materials and budgets for 40 more minutes. And Alexander nodded at the right moments while thinking of something else. That afternoon, he called the architecture firm with a perfectly valid, professional pretext. He spoke with the architect. At the end, as if in passing, he asked for the full name of the assistant who had brought the blueprints. Clara Miller Smith, 29 years old, design graduate, had been at the firm for 2 years. Before that, she had worked for an events company. Before that, she had paid for her degree by working weekends at a downtown coffee shop. Alexander, I knew all of this within 48 hours. Not because he was spying on her, he hadn't reached that level of obsession yet. That would come later, but because he was a man who, when interested in something, studied it. It was a business habit that sometimes spilled over into his personal life. He called her the next day with another equally valid professional pretext. She answered with the same efficiency as at the meeting. Concise. Without coyness. Without the slight modulation most people adopted when speaking to him, that mixture of flattery and caution that had bored him since he was 30. After the call, Alexander stared at the phone. Then he dialed the reservation number for a restaurant downtown and called Clara again. "There's something I'd prefer to discuss in person," he said. "Are you free?" "Thursday for a meeting." "For dinner?" Brief silence. "That's not exactly a work meeting, is it?" Another longer silence. "I have the evening shift free on Thursday," she said. And he knew that was a yes. Even though it sounded like a schedule. On Thursday, they had dinner at a place where a glass of wine cost what Clara earned in 2 hours of work. He knew it, she knew it too. Neither of them mentioned it because both were too proud to talk about it. though for completely different reasons. They dined for 2.5 hours. Alexander spoke less than usual. She spoke more than he expected. She told him about the neighborhood, where she grew up, about her mother, a seamstress, about how she had learned to draw in the margins of school notebooks because there was no money for drawing paper. She told him how she had gotten a partial scholarship and how she had covered the rest by working Saturdays, smelling of coffee. She didn't tell it with bitterness. She told it like someone who tells her story without needing the other person to validate or pity her. Alexander listened, which, according to his personal assistant, was something he rarely did in non-business conversations. When he drove her home, a small apartment in a walk-up building in the Lower East Side, 4th floor without an elevator. He didn't kiss her. She didn't expect him to either. That had been one of the things that had most bewildered him that night. Clara didn't expect anything from him that she hadn't decided was possible to receive. They said goodbye at the building entrance. She thanked him for dinner with the same naturalness she would have thanked anyone. He walked to the car, sat down. He didn't start it immediately. He thought he hadn't felt this in years. That uncomfortable warmth in his chest that was more question than certainty. He called her Friday and Saturday, and the following Monday he booked tickets for both of them to an exhibition she had mentioned in passing that interested him. Something about documentary photography. Nothing glamorous. In a small gallery in Chelsea. When she opened the message with the reservation details, it took her 10 minutes to reply. She just said, "I only mentioned it once." He replied, "Yes." She took another minute. Wednesday at 7. Then. And that's how these things that later hurt a lot began. Not with fireworks. With a documentary photography exhibition on a Wednesday at 7. The romance was one of those that built its own world with a speed that frightens when you look at it in retrospect. In 6 weeks, they had their favorite coffee shops, their walking routes through Central Park, their private jokes, their silences that didn't need filling. Clara was one of those people who didn't need to talk to be present. In Alexander, it produced an almost chemical effect because he lived surrounded by noise, meetings, negotiations, calls, people constantly wanting something from him and being in silence with. Clara felt like lowering the volume of the entire world. She challenged him without strategy. She didn't do it to manipulate him or to keep his interest. She simply had her own opinions and stated them with that calm of someone who doesn't need to be proven right to know she is. One night at his apartment, after dinner, something she had cooked, insisting on cooking, because she hated feeling waited on all the time, they had an argument about something of no real importance. Alexander was used to arguments ending when he stopped talking. With Clara, that didn't work. She waited for him to finish, gave him 10 seconds, and then continued exactly where he had left off. Without attitude, without yelling, without giving up. He looked at her during those 10 seconds and thought she was the most interesting woman he had met in 40 years of his life. Surrounded by interesting people, the tension between them grew in the way inevitable things grow. Slowly, at first. Then, suddenly. The first few weeks. Contact was just that. Contact. A brush of their hands when they walked. The way he placed his palm on the small of her back to guide her in a restaurant. a gesture that was half habit and half excuse. Then there was that time they were reviewing something on the computer, and he leaned over her shoulder to see the screen, and she turned her head slightly, and he was an inch from her face, and neither of them breathed for a second that lasted longer than it should have. It was a November night. They had gone to see a movie in a downtown cinema. One of those long, quiet films that Clara liked and that Alexander had learned to watch with a patience he didn't know he possessed. Midway through the movie, without either of them planning it, their hands met on the armrest. Neither withdrew. When they stepped out onto the street, the New York November cold was real and unforgiving. Clara had the collar of her jacket up. Alexander put his arm around her shoulders as naturally as if he had always done so. And she didn't pull away. They walked 3 blocks like that. At the entrance of a bar they knew. He stopped. She stopped too. They looked at each other. And it was she who said, softly, as if thinking aloud, "This is going to get complicated, isn't it?" He looked into her eyes. Those clear eyes he had already memorized without having datas. Decided to. Probably. She nodded slowly. All right. And he took her face in his hands with the same calm with which he made decisions that changed companies and kissed her. It wasn't a hasty kiss. It was the kind of kiss that takes a long time to start and then doesn't know when to end. She held his jacket with her fingers. He ran his hand through her hair and she lifted her face and closed her eyes. And for a moment, the November cold and the New York City noise and the rest of the world ceased to exist in a rather unreasonable way. Listen. I wouldn't interrupt you if it weren't important. That kiss matters. That kiss is the root of everything that comes after. Because it wasn't the kiss of 2 people starting something light. It was the kiss of 2 people who already knew from that instant that this would cost them something. Sometimes you feel those things. What followed that kiss were the most intense months in Alexander Sterling's adult life, months in which he learned things about himself that no board meeting had taught him. He learned that he could be patient, that he could listen for a whole hour about the design project that was keeping her awake without looking at his phone even once, that he could laugh at himself when she looked at him with that, really, expression she reserved for his more involuntary CEO moments. He also learned that desire can become a way of knowing someone if one has the patience to build it slowly. Although with Clara, patience had a natural limit because there was something between their bodies that worked like its own physics. A gravity that didn't ask permission or wait for the right moment. As if they weren't 2 people choosing each other, but 2 things recognizing each other. Nights at his apartment were a territory they both explored carefully. As if they knew that what was building between them was fragile in one sense, precious in another. She would arrive sometimes with her hair damp from the rain and that mixed scent of rain and something that was only hers. And he would greet her at the door and take her coat. And he would look at her for a moment before saying, "Anything?" And she would look at him too. And in that silence, there was more conversation than in many hours of words. Their bodies understood each other on their own, like separate entities that had reached an agreement long before their owners. He would brush her neck, and she would close her eyes before deciding to. She would place her hand on his chest, and he would stop breathing. In that specific way, one stops breathing when something matters too much. They fit together in a way that had no rational explanation and that they had both learned not to try to explain. There were nights that began in the kitchen trying to cook something and ended without having cooked anything. Nights where time stopped having a clear direction, where hours passed without either of them counting them or wanting to count them. Nights where he would say her name very softly and she would close at her eyes, and that was all she needed to understand exactly what he meant. Nights that seemed endless and that neither of them wanted to end. Nights where the faster world outside the apartment could wait. I won't tell you more about those nights, because you don't need me to tell you. You're already imagining it. And what you're imagining is probably quite similar. What does matter is what happened during the day. By day, Alexander Sterling was the CEO of Sterling Group. And the CEO of Sterling Group had a family. A family with a surname that had been building power in New York City for 3 generations. A mother who had been born knowing exactly what kind of woman should occupy every place in that world. And Clara Miller Smith, with her 4th floor walk-up in the Lower East Side and her half scholarship and her flea market jacket. I didn't fit into any of those places. Not because she wasn't worthy of them, but because the Sterling world didn't operate on worth, it operated on surname. The dinner was in February. Alexander proposed it with more clumsiness than usual, which was already a sign. He told her he wanted her to meet his parents. And he said it in the way one says something that has been postponed for too long, with that tone of someone who has already made a decision and prefers not to open it for debate. Clara looked at him for a moment. Are you sure? Why wouldn't I be? She didn't answer that. She nodded. She said yes. And he interpreted that silence as acceptance. It took him weeks to understand it was a gratter question. The Sterling family mansion was in Greenwich. White. Geometric. With a garden that in February had the austerity of expensive winter gardens. Clara arrived in a simple, elegant black dress. The right shoes. Her hair loose over her shoulders. She had made an effort without the effort being noticeable. That was also part of her dignity. Alexander introduced her. His father extended his hand, with the functional indifference of a man who had already made up his mind before meeting her. His mother, Eleanor Sterling Montoya, greeted her with a smile that had the temperature of a January boardroom. The first 20 minutes were perfectly civilized, which is the most elegant form of cruelty. Eleanor asked about the architecture firm. Clara answered. Eleanor asked how long she had been in the sector. Clara answered. Eleanor said, "How interesting," with the exact tone one uses that phrase when finding nothing interesting at all. At the table, the wine was from a winery Clara knew about because she had read about it, not because she had ever tasted it. She didn't, and say that. The turn came during the second course. Eleanor carefully put down her fork. Like someone who has decided, it's time. Clara. Do you have family in New York? My mother and a sister. Ah? How nice. And what does your mother do? She's a seamstress. A very brief, calculated pause. Eleanor took a sip of wine. What a noble profession. Clara didn't blink. It is. She raised 2 daughters alone. That requires a lot more than vocation. Eleanor smiled. That smile. Of course. Of course. A longer pause. Alexander, I told us you haven't known each other long. How long? 3 months? 4. Alexander said. 4. How quickly things happen when one is young. Eleanor looked at Clara, with that look that needs no words to say everything it wants to say. Youthful. Affairs have that charm. Don't they? That intensity that lasts only as long as it lasts. And then one matures and understands that there are more lasting decisions. Silence at the table. Clara placed her glass on the tablecloth with a calm that can only be achieved when inside. One is making a considerable effort. I understand perfectly what you're saying. Mrs. Sterling. How nice. Eleanor said. Satisfied. I just want to make sure you also understand what I'm telling you. I didn't come here to ask for permission. I came for dinner. The kind of silence that weighs heavily. If they could have heard that silence, they would have noticed that Alexander's father stopped cutting his meat. That Alexander held his breath. That Eleanor Sterling Montoya found, for the first time in a great long time, someone who didn't bend. Eleanor regained her composure in 3 seconds. She smiled again. That icy smile. What a lively character. Then she looked at her son. Alexander. I need to discuss Lisbon before Monday. And she changed the subject. As if Clara had ceased to exist. Alexander let her change the subject. That was what Clara never forgave him for, not what his mother said. But what he didn't say. The ride back was in silence. A different kind of silence than that of long movies and downtown cinemas. This silence had temperature, it had edges. Clara looked out the car window as the New York City lights passed by. Alexander drove, with both hands on the wheel. Something he never did. Which she didn't know. But which was a sign of his tension. Clara. Not a single word. She didn't look up from the window. Let me explain. What are you going to explain? She turned to him then. And Alexander saw something in her eyes he hadn't seen before. It wasn't tears. Clara didn't cry easily. It was that specific wound one gets when someone you trust leaves you unprotected at a moment when you needed the exact opposite. She was telling me, in front of me, that I'm a youthful mistake. And you changed the subject with her. She's difficult. I'm not difficult. Silence. I'm not asking you to fight with your family. Alexander. I'm asking you to be present when you're with me. That's all. They arrived at Clara's apartment. She got out of the car. At the door, she paused for a second, as if she was going to say something more. She didn't. She went upstairs alone. Alexander took 40 minutes to start the car. The weeks that followed had that texture of things that are not quite fixed. There were moments of real warmth between them. Moments where everything felt like before, afternoons in Central Park. Quiet dinners. Nights where the outside world didn't exist. But the dinner had left something. Like a crack in a glass that isn't visible unless the light hits it just right. And Alexander, who was an expert at sustaining structures with pressure and will, decided that if I didn't look at the crack directly, maybe it would disappear. It didn't disappear. Clara discovered she was pregnant on a Tuesday in April. Alone in her bathroom. With the test in her hand and her heart doing something. That wasn't exactly fear nor exactly joy. But a mixture of the two that only exists in that specific instant. She sat on the edge of the bathtub. Stayed there for 10 minutes. Then got up. Washed her face. Went to work. It took her 5 days to tell Alexander. 5 days in which she saw him and talked with him, and cooked with him and slept beside him and said nothing because she needed to know exactly how she felt before knowing how he felt. When she told him, it was direct, without beating around the bush, without prepared drama. She told him she was 6 weeks pregnant and that she had already made some decisions about it. And what she wanted to know was how he felt. Alexander listened with the stillness of a man who has just been told something that reorganizes his entire mental map in one blow. He said the right thing. He said he was there, that they would handle this together, that she didn't have to worry. Clara looked at him. What exactly does handle this together mean? Pause. It means I support you. That I won't leave you alone with this. I didn't ask if you would leave me alone. I asked what my pregnancy means to you. And there Alexander Sterling, who knew how to handle shareholder meetings and international crises and $30 million negotiations, was left without the exact words. Not because he felt nothing, but because what he felt was too much, and he didn't have the language to say it. 40 years in a family where emotions were not named but managed do not teach you to say certain things at the moment when they matter most. Clara interpreted that silence as the answer. It was not the answer he intended to give, but the answer his silence was giving without him knowing it. The following weeks were filled with a tension neither of them named, because both knew that naming it was opening something they didn't know how to close. The crack in the glass that was already visible. It was Alexander's mother who sped everything up. Eleanor Sterling found out about the pregnancy through channels that were never entirely clear and went to We Prayed Sai's The Rise, 9dgs.et. See Clara alone at her Lower East Side apartment. She showed up unannounced in her cashmere coat and designer bag and that icy smile. And Clara opened the door, because she didn't know she had learned that she should not open it. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. Eleanor didn't yell. Eleanor never yelled. She spoke in that soft, clear voice used by people who have had enough power for long enough not to need to raise their voice. She told Clara that she understood the situation, that these things happened, that the Sterling family was willing to be generous, that there was a reasonable sum that could help Clara get back on her feet comfortably, that Alexander had a planned future involving certain alliances, certain surnames, certain responsibilities that someone in his position could not ignore, that this did not mean he didn't love her in his own way. Those 2 words, in his own way, Clara listened to until the end. Then she stood up, opened the door. Thank you for coming, Mrs. Sterling. The exit is this way. Eleanor left. Clara closed the door. She stood in the center of her small living room with her plants in the window and her books on the shelves and that life of hers she had built with real effort. And she understood something with a clarity that hurt us. Only clarity hurts. That in Alexander's world, she would always have to ask permission to exist. That the problem wasn't Eleanor Sterling. The problem was an entire system, an architecture of class and surname and expectations in which she had no place, and that Alexander, who loved her in his own way, was not. I'm going to destroy that system for her, because destroying it required a courage no one had taught him to have. That night she spoke with Alexander. She told him about his mother's visit. He stiffened, said that shouldn't have happened, that he would talk to her, that he was sorry, Clara listened. Do you love me? She asked directly. Without trickery. He looked at her. And in that gaze there was so much that it was almost painful to see. Of course. I do. More than that world of yours? Silence. Not the silence of someone who doesn't know the answer, but the silence of someone who knows the answer and can't say it yet. And that told her everything. I didn't leave because I didn't love you, she told him later. Calmer. In her way of saying important things, as if she had thought about them twice as long as it took her to say them. I left because I understood that in your world, I would always have to ask permission to exist. Alexander opened his mouth, then closed it. And I can't teach that to a child. She left with a medium suitcase, her books, and the plants from the window. Not dramatically, without a scene. Like someone who had made a decision long enough ago not to need to make it. Grant. Alexander tried to find her in the following days. He called. She didn't answer. He sent her messages. She replied to only one. In writing. With her usual clarity, which left no cracks. She didn't want visits. She didn't want money. She didn't want calls. When the baby was born, he could know it had been born. Nothing else for now. He read that message 3 times. Then he put it away, without replying. Because he knew, with the same certainty with which he knew, that his mother was right in terms of family strategy, and that made him complicit in something with no pretty name. That any pressure at that moment would confirm exactly the worst about him, that he was the kind of man who used power to bend others' will. He didn't want to be that man. Though he still didn't quite know how not to be. Alexander let her go. Or so he made it seem. Spoiler. He didn't let her go. No. Man who has known someone like Clara Miller can simply let her go. What he can do is pretend he let her go while hiring private investigators and canceling Hong Kong board meetings to stare at photos of a baby with his own eyes. That's what he can do. And that's exactly what Alexander did for 18 months. He devised a plan that took 4 months to execute. Alexander was meticulous, even in his obsessions. Not impulsive. He had thought about it from all angles. Discarded it 3 times. Rebuilt it. He knew what Clara would think if she found out. He knew how much rage it would generate. He knew it. And he did it anyway because it was the only path he could think of that didn't involve showing up at her door with a bouquet of flowers that she would rightfully throw in his face. He bought a mid-sized professional services company that had been looking for a pro-side buyer for years. A real company. With real operations. With real employees. He integrated it into his group with the discretion of someone who makes acquisitions of that size every month. No one raised an eyebrow. Then he restructured the design and communications department of that company. He created a new position, direct assistant to the general director with access to all projects in the area. Competitive salary. Stable contract. The kind of position someone with Clara's profile would find difficult to find on the market. The announcement was published anonymously by the company, without the Sterling Group name. The selection process was real. There were interviews. There were other candidates. Clara passed all phases because she was genuinely an Emmer, the best candidate. That was what he repeated to himself to be able to sleep the day she signed the contract. Alexander was in Amsterdam closing another deal. His phone vibrated with a notification from his assistant. Miss Mela. Signs today. Alexander looked at it. Put his phone away. Continued with the meeting. Inside, he felt something that in another emotional language might be called relief. In his own, he simply called it a step in the right direction. The following Monday, Clara Miller arrived for her first day of work. She arrived punctually, in simple, well-worn clothes, a cream-colored blouse, and dark pants. Her hair loose over her shoulders because it was warm. She arrived with that first-day energy, that combination of nerves and determination that she always transformed into visible efficiency. The receptionist was waiting for her, led her through the building, showed her desk, explained the structure. Tomorrow, you have a presentation meeting with general management. The receptionist said. Clara nodded. That day went well. She learned the computer system, met 2 colleagues, took notes on 3 pending projects. It was an uncomplicated professional Monday. On Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock, her desk phone rang. General management is waiting for you. Clara picked up her notebook, took the elevator to the executive floor, walked down the hall to the indicated door. She knocked twice. Come in. She opened the door, and there was Alexander Sterling, standing by the windows in that dark suit he wore on Tuesdays because on Mondays he reserved gray and on Fridays navy blue. With that posture of a man who has learned to occupy a room since he can remember. With that face she knew by heart and had we've been trying to forget for 18 months with mixed results. Clara stopped in the doorway. He looked at her. Neither spoke for 3 seconds, that were significantly longer than the clock indicated. It was she who spoke first, her voice calmer than she felt inside. You did this. Alexander didn't reply immediately. That was already a response. Tell me you didn't buy me a job to make yourself feel better. He moved slowly, unhurriedly, from the windows to the desk. He looked at her with that calm that Clara had always found so irritating. Because she didn't know if it was real coldness or the greatest effort of control she had ever seen in a human being. I didn't buy your job, he said. I bought the company that could hire you. Clara looked at him. She looked at him for a good while and then, in a voice that didn't rise in pitch but carried the full weight of 18 months, she said, You are absolutely incredible. And here I'll pause for a second because I need you to appreciate the full scene. She has been alone for 18 months with a baby, behind on rent, rebuilding her life from scratch. He has been buying companies, paying investigators, and canceling Hong Kong board meetings for 18 months. And now they are both in this glass room on the 41st floor. And she is looking at him as if she has just discovered a new species of animal not found in any zoology book. Absolutely incredible, she said. And I say, she's right. You need the job, Alexander said in his way of stating uncomfortable truths, without anesthesia. Don't use that against me. I'm not using it. I'm telling you. What's the difference? The difference is that you can leave right now if you want. The door isn't closed. The contract has a termination clause with 1 week's notice. You signed a contract with a real company for a real salary, for a real job. What you do with that is your decision. Clara looked at him, looked at the door, looked at Alexander again. What do you want from this? He didn't answer that immediately. When he did, it was with more honesty than she expected. I want you to be well. I want to meet my son. And I want you to give me the chance to do things the way I should have done them from the beginning. You can't buy a company with that. Something that, in another man, might have. Even a smile briefly crossed Alexander's face. For me, I can, Clara breathed. She tucked her notebook under her arm. I have conditions. Tell me. My job is mine. You don't give me special treatment. You don't cover my mistakes. You don't tell anyone who I am to you. Agreed. And you don't approach my son until I decide. A pause. The longest one. Agreed. She nodded once. She turned towards the door. Clara. She stopped, without turning around. What's his name? A pause. Matteo. Silence. Alexander. I said nothing else. She left the room. He stood looking at the closed door for a moment. He didn't know how long lasted. Then he sat in his chair, opened his computer, tried to concentrate on the Amsterdam report. Matteo. His son's name. Thus Matteo. The first few days at the company were what Clara had decided they would be. Professional. She arrived punctually. She left when her work was done. Neither before nor after. She replied to Alexander's emails with the same efficiency with which she replied to the rest of the team. She treated him with the precise, temperate courtesy of someone who knows exactly where the line is and has no intention of crossing it. Alexander observed this. He observed it with the attention of a man who knows a person well and recognizes, behind that, impeccable efficiency, the effort it takes to maintain it. Because Clara was good at many things. But what she had never learned to feign was total indifference. And he knew her too well not to see it. The tension between them was the kind that no one in the building could name. But everyone could feel. The kind of tension that makes people in a meeting instinctively choose not to sit between the two. There were moments where the Bashu and Ibrahim distance they both maintained cost more than it seemed. One afternoon, reviewing a supplier report together, Alexander leaned over her desk to point something out on the papers. He was a few inches from her. Clara felt his cologne. That scent she hadn't managed to forget entirely, although she had seriously tried. And she didn't look up immediately. She kept staring at the numbers on the page, for a second longer than necessary. Here, he said, pointing to a figure. Saw it. She replied without moving. There was an instant where neither of them did anything. Then he straightened up. She picked up her pen. That night, on the subway ride home, Clara realized her jaw had been clenched since that afternoon. It wasn't anger, it was something else. And that something else was the problem. Alexander tried to maintain control. The control lasted exactly 10 days. On the 11th day, a colleague from the communications department, young, with an air of self-made smugness, the kind who carries coffee in designer cups, began finding excuses to appear at Clara's desk. He brought her documents he could have emailed, asked her questions he could have solved himself. He laughed at, in his own comments 0.2 of a second before they were funny. Alexander watched him from his office through the glass. He observed that Clara responded with natural kindness, without flirtation or coyness, but with that warmth she gave without calculation to anyone who treated her well. He observed that the colleague suggested they get coffee. He observed that Clara said yes, with no reason not to. That afternoon, Alexander called the colleague in question to a meeting, completely justified in terms of work, which lasted 40 minutes longer than necessary. Was that a coincidence? Of course not, Alexander admitted. Of course not. Sometimes men who run empires manage their jealousy with the same energy they would use to reorganize a department. It is what it is. Clara found out 2 days later. She entered his office with a report, placed it on the desk, and when he looked up, she was looking at him with that specific expression he knew well. About Marcus. What about Marcus? Alexander. It was a work meeting you called just as we were leaving for coffee. Scheduling coincidence. Clara looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. Then, you lost the right to jealousy when you let your mother tell me what she told me in my own home. And she left. Alexander was left holding the report, with the feeling that he had just lost an argument he thought he wasn't even having. The following week, he discovered something about Clara's apartment that Mendez had mentioned in passing in the last report. The kitchen faucet had been dripping for 2 weeks, and the landlord wasn't fixing it. Alexander discreetly called the building management. The faucet was repaired the next day. It took Clara 3 days to connect the dots. When she did, she walked into his office. The faucet. Alexander didn't look up from his computer. I don't know what faucet you're talking about. The faucet in my kitchen that had been dripping for 2 weeks, that suddenly the landlord decided to repair. Even though I've been ignoring my messages for 6 months. Sometimes landlords react. Alexander looked up. I don't need you to buy my life in installments. I'm not trying to buy you. No. You're trying to manage me. And there's a difference. That hit him in the chest because it was exactly true. And they both knew it. I don't know how else to do it, he said with an honesty that surprised even himself. Clara looked at him. For a second, something in her expression softened. Just a second. Learn. It was a Wednesday afternoon. Alexander had been resisting the urge for weeks. He had driven through the area where Clara lived 3 times with pretexts he didn't even believe himself. But that Wednesday he had no pretext. He just had a canceled meeting and 45 free minutes and an address he knew by heart without ever having looked it up on a map. The daycare where Clara took Mateo was a furnace, 6-minute walk from her building. Alexander knew this because Mendez had told him. And that, although he still didn't want to admit it, was part of the problem. He parked half a block away, walked slowly, stopped at the opposite corner. Mothers and fathers waited at the door. It was pickup time. There was children's noise inside. That specific hubbub of daycares that has something of chaos and something of raw joy. Clara came out forth. She wore a brown coat he had never seen her and knew, or at least new to him, and her hair pulled back. She walked with the stroller folded under her arm because it was easier that way. With her efficiency as a woman who had learned to do alone what once required 2 people, and behind her, holding the hand of a caregiver who was passing her the stroller strap, came Mateo. Alexander had not prepared for this to see him face to face. In motion. Life-sized. Mateo was 11 months old. He walked with that sovereign instability of children who have just discovered that legs are for more than they thought. He wore a blue wool hat that was slightly crooked. His cheeks were red from the cold. And when Clara knelt to pick him up, the child raised his talpier arms to her with a happy urgency that made Alexander feel something in his chest that had no name in any business language he knew. She picked him up. Matteo put his hand on her face. Clara laughed. And Alexander, 50 feet away, with both feet planted on the New York City sidewalk, and the world continuing its course around as if nothing was happening. I felt something inside him fracture in a way that could not be fixed with money, or with will, or with any of the tools he had used his whole life. That child had his eyes and his mother's laugh. And he existed in the world without having chosen to, as all children exist, with an innocence so absolute that it was physically unbearable to watch from the outside. Alexander remained on that corner until Clara turned down the next street. Then he went to his car, sat down, didn't start it. That's when Alexander Sterling understood the true cruelty of his punishment. It wasn't that she didn't love him, it was that his own son could grow up without knowing he existed. And that was the only thing for which all his money, all his power, all his ability to buy companies and cancel meetings and control thermostats was absolutely useless. That night he didn't sleep. It was days later when what Alexander had not foreseen clearly enough occurred. He had forgotten, or perhaps hadn't wanted to think about it, that he had Menda's last envelope in the left drawer of his desk. He had left it there on a Friday with the intention of taking it home. He forgot it. Clara came in to leave him an urgent document when he was in Agrida's meeting on another floor. The drawer was ajar. It wasn't snooping. It was the kind of thing that happens when someone looks for a pen in a familiar desk that isn't theirs. The envelope had no sender, but it had photos. She saw them for 3 seconds. Long enough. It was her with Matteo in the park on Thursdays, with the flea market jacket. When Alexander returned to his office 20 minutes later, Clara was standing by his desk, not with visible anger, but with something worse, with that cold calm she used when she was truly hurt. The envelope was on his desk. "How long?" she asked. Alexander looked at the envelope, then at her. "Since Matteo was born." Silence. "Photos of me and my son every week. You wanted to know we were okay. You weren't taking care of me." Alexander. Her voice was low, without trembling, without yelling. "You were spying on me. There's a huge difference between the two. And I need you to understand that." He said nothing. Not because he had no answer, but because the right answer did not exist. "You asked permission to meet Matteo," she continued. "That was good. But you've known things about my life for months that I didn't give you permission to know. That's not good. I know. You know. Or you're saying it because I'm looking at you." A long pause. "Both," he admitted. Clara gathered her things from the chair. "Stop it. I want to know how Matteo and I are. You ask me like anyone else." She left without waiting for a reply. That afternoon, Alexander called Mendes. Terminate the contract. Mendes didn't ask anything. He hung up, and though no one saw it or recorded it, that was the moment Alexander Sterling did something for the first time that had no strategic return or calculated benefit. He simply let go of, in control because someone had rightfully asked him to. For a man raised in the crowded logic of power, that was harder than it seems. Saturday morning. Alexander arrived at Clara's apartment 10 minutes early, which, for him, was almost aggressive punctuality. And with a gift he knew, even before entering, was the wrong one. It was a handcrafted wooden horse, imported, with hand-carved details. It cost what Clara earned in a week. The salesman had told him it was educational and classic, with the face of someone who detects paternal guilt from 10 feet away and prices accordingly. Clara opened the door, looked at Alexander, looked at the horse, looked back at him. He's 11 months old. Alexander. The salesman said it was educational. The salesman saw your guilty face and charged. You triple. She let him in. The apartment was small and clean, and had that specific warmth of places where someone has made a home with what they had, without pretense or resignation. There were plants in the window, the same ones as always, the ones she had taken with her, and books on the shelves and toys neatly arranged in a basket near the basket, sofa and a baby blanket folded over the armchair. Alexander looked at all of that. Then he looked at the child. Matteo was on the floor, in the center of the living room, with the absolute concentration of someone engaged in a task of utmost importance. The task was trying to fit a round piece into a square hole, which wasn't working, a fact that didn't seem to discourage him at all. Alexander stood there. He didn't know what to do with his hands. That man who knew exactly where to put his hands in a boardroom, in a negotiation, in any conceivable professional context, stood in his son's living room, his hands hanging as if they were accessories he didn't remember ordering. Matteo looked up, looked at this strange man standing in the living room, assessed him with the brutal efficiency of babies who have no social filters yet and decide in seconds whether something is interesting or not. Apparently, Alexander passed the filter because Matteo extended his arm and offered him the round piece. Alexander bent down, took it. I tried to fit it into the square hole. It didn't work. Matteo looked at him with a patience that was either compassion or amusement. Hard to tell at 11 months. Clara, from the kitchen where she was making coffee to have something to do with her hands other than watching them. I heard silence for a moment and then heard the child's laugh. Small, resounding, unreserved. She stopped by the doorframe. Alexander was on the floor in his expensive suit, trying to assemble a plastic shape sorter while Matteo supervised the process with the serious attention of a quality inspector. Alexander looked at him. He looked at him with an expression Clara had never seen on him in all the months she had known him, uncontrolled, uncalculated, with something so open and so vulnerable that she had to look away. Because, if she kept looking, she would feel something she wasn't ready to feel. Yet, when Alexander finally picked up the child and held him in his arms for the first time, he said nothing for several seconds. He just breathed. Matteo gripped his finger with his whole hand. And Alexander, in a very soft, almost voiceless tone, said, "Sorry I took so long." Shon. And if anyone at this moment felt absolutely nothing, You might need to check your pulse. I'm just saying. For a moment. Is Alexander earning it or not yet? Tell me in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel, this is exactly the moment. Eleanor Sterling took exactly 16 days to find out Clara was working at the prize group. She showed up on a Thursday at noon. Unannounced. That was her style. Clara was in the executive floor hallway when she saw her step out of the primer elevator. Instinct told her to turn away. Dignity told her not to. She stood still. Eleanor saw her. She showed no surprise. She already knew before she came. She walked towards her with that calm of someone who is in no hurry, because she feels time belongs to her. I see you found your way back through the service entrance. Clara held her gaze. Don't worry, Mom. This time I came through HR. It was more humiliating. But at least there was coffee. An executive walking by pretended not to have heard. Two assistants exchanged a quick glance. Eleanor was about to reply when Alexander's office door opened. He had heard from inside. He had recognized his mother's voice in the hallway before she finished the first sentence. He came out, looked at his mother, looked at Clara. And this time, he didn't stay silent. She didn't come back. He said with a calm that wasn't coldness, but something. Then, sir. I brought her back. Eleanor. This isn't the time. And if anyone has something to say about my son's mother, they say it to me. In front of me. Not in a hallway while I'm 10 feet away. Silence on the executive floor. Eleanor looked at him, then looked at Clara, then looked back at her son with that assessment of a woman who has been the most powerful person in any room she enters for decades. We'll talk at home. Of course, Alexander said. Whenever you want. Eleanor left. The elevator doors closed. In the hallway remained Alexander, Clara, and the silence of all who had listened without looking. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. Are you okay? He asked. Yes. A pause. Thank you, she said softly, without effusiveness. Like someone thanking someone for doing what they should have done from the beginning. Without more drama than necessary. Alexander nodded, returned to his office, and Clara stood for a moment longer in the hallway. Her heart doing something she preferred not to analyze too much. What came next was the family's offensive, which arrived on 3 fronts. Alexander's father called him to say he was risking his position on the board. The family lawyer discreetly suggested it might be convenient to formalize things regarding the child, which was a steel euphemism for saying they could request a paternity test and define legal custody. And a journalist from an ND economic magazine received anonymous information that the CEO of Sterling Group had had a child outside of a formal relationship. Alexander responded to the journalist in person, without aggression, with the calm of a man who knows what he says matters. He confirmed he had a son. He confirmed the mother was someone he knew and respected. He said the rest was private life, and that if that was news, the industry had bigger problems than him. The journalist didn't publish anything that could be used against Clara. Alexander's mother sent Clara an envelope. Inside was a check and a 2-paragraph handwritten letter in the perfect script of someone who has had a berries asses endis.com, a secretary for decades, but knows certain things carry more weight when handwritten. Clara folded the check, put it back in the envelope. Left it on Alexander's desk, on top of the check. She left a note. Your mother already bought me one humiliation. Tell her I'm not selling the child in the second round. Clara Miller. Ladies and gentlemen, take note. The storm arrived on a Wednesday night when there were still 3 people in the building, the security guard on the ground floor, Alexander in his office, and Clara, who had stayed to finish an urgent report due at 9 the next morning. Edapt 30. The New York City sky decided it had contained enough and opened. Without warning, Clara looked out the windows. She had to pick Matteo up at 9 from Lucy's house. She looked at her phone. Called Lucy. Don't worry. He's fine. Here. I'll send you photos. Come when you can. Clara breathed. She returned to the report. At Noah, Cincisprezece. With the storm still in full force. She finished. Gathered her things. Put on her coat. Passing through the executive floor hallway. Alexander's office had light. She didn't think anything. She kept walking. She reached the ground floor. The security guard looked at her with the face of someone who, at 9:15 at night, in a storm, had seen enough. No taxis available. The subway is delayed due to flooding at 2 stations. A pause. I'd wait. Miss. Clara looked at the door. The rain beat against the glass with the conviction of someone who has all night. She went back up. Knocked on Alexander's office door. What are you still doing? Here? He said when he saw her. Same as you. Working. A pause. No transport. He got up. Went to the side cabinet and took out a wool jacket he kept there for early morning trips. He held it out to her. For the cold. I'm fine. Alexander. She took it. Put it on. It smelled of him. That cologne of his that mixed something fresh with something darker and that she had spent months trying not to remember precisely. She said nothing about it. She sat on the office sofa with her laptop. He returned to his desk. For 40 minutes, they worked in silence, with the storm outside and the warm light of the office inside and a distance between them that was physical. But not the only thing there was. It was Alexander who spoke first. Matteo. Is he okay with Lucy? He's fine. He sleeps. Well. Pause. Now he does. The first few months were complicated. Alexander nodded. He looked at the screen, but wasn't reading what was on it. Were you alone? I had Lucy. That wasn't what he was asking. Clara put her laptop on the sofa. She looked at him. Yes. I was alone. Silence. I know. Pause. I don't know how to tell you, I'm sorry without it sounding like it's not enough. Then don't say it yet. When? When you prove it enough so the words don't. I have to do so much work. Alexander got up from his desk. He didn't walk towards her abruptly. He walked slowly. Like someone who knows that space matters and that crossing it wrong can break what little there is. He stood a meter from the singed sofa. Clara looked up at him. And there was that distance between them that was a meter, and was also everything that had happened and everything they both knew had not yet happened. And all the tension of weeks of offices and hallways and calculated glances not to last longer than convenient. Don't use that look, she said softly. What look? You know which one. I don't know how else to. Look when it's you. Clara held that sentence for a second, then stood up. They were closer than they had been in a long time. He could see the details of her face that are only seen up close. She could perceive the warmth he generated. That specific warmth of his that had to do with presence and with size and with being there very physically. He raised his hand, stopping it an inch from her. Face. A question. She didn't move back. He brushed her cheek. Just that. With his knuckles barely. The smallest possible way to touch someone. Clara closed her eyes for a second, then opened them. Took a step back. Don't confuse nostalgia with love. He looked at her. I confused pride with strength. Yes. But I never confused what I felt for you. Clara picked up her laptop from the sofa. His jacket was still on. The storm is stopping. Little. I'll call a taxi. I'll drive you. Alexander. I'll just take you home. No agenda. No condition. A long pause. Okay. And that. Okay, that wasn't surrender, but minimal openness. That cost what it costs to open, even a millimeter, a door you closed with all your pain. That, my dear friends, was the first real step, not Alexander's first, but hers. And Clara Miller's first steps always counted double. The Sterling Group's annual gala was one of those events that, on the New York City social calendar, served as a marker of who was doing well. 5-star hotels, dark suits, polished speeches, alliances forged between cocktails and dessert. Alexander had attended 12 such galas. He had never liked them. He had always gone. This year, Clara was part of the communications team organizing the event. It was she who designed the layout of the materials, who coordinated the suppliers, who resolved 3 last-minute crises with that quiet efficiency that, by then, was her trademark at the company. She arrived at the hotel with the team, in a simple black dress that was exactly right for her role that night. She hadn't gone to shine, she had gone to work. Alexander saw her arrive from across the ballroom, saw her speak to the catering manager, resolve something with the sound technician, across the room in her way of moving, that didn't ask thing for passage but simply took it because she knew where she was going. And he thought she was the most capable person he knew and that he had left her alone for 18 months with that capability and a baby and overdue rent. And that had a name that wasn't pretty. Eleanor Sterling arrived with Alexander's father at exactly 9 o'clock. She found Clara by the materials table giving instructions to someone on the team. She approached. You still have time to correct this mistake, she said softly. But not in secret. Clara turned slowly. She looked at her. The mistake of working well. Mrs. Sterling? Or excuse me. Which one are you referring to? Don't be impertinent. I'm not. I'm direct. There's a difference. Eleanor was about to continue when Alexander arrived. He had crossed the entire ballroom when he saw the scene. He didn't run, he walked. But with a speed that was not typical of gala events. Mother. Eleanor turned around. Alexander. I know what you were doing. Silence. The immediate circle of people who had listened, without looking directly, waited, without knowing what they were waiting for. Alexander looked at his mother, then at Clara. then at the entire ballroom, and took the presentation microphone from the master of ceremonies 10 feet away. Ladies and gentlemen, excuse the interruption. The room quieted. Alexander spoke without preparation, without the speech he had rehearsed for that night, with the voice of a man who had decided to stop managing what he felt. 18 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life. I let the woman I loved leave, believing she had no place in my world. Pause. The truth is, my world was too small for her. Total silence in the ballroom. I'm not here to clean up any surname tonight. I'm here to say that the only surname that matters to me is the one my son will proudly carry if his mother allows me to be by his side. He put down the microphone. In the ballroom, not even the ice in the glasses could be heard. Eleanor Sterling had an expression that was not easy to read because it mixed several things that rarely coexisted on her face. Alexander's father looked at the tablecloth. And Clara, standing by the materials table with a clip in her hand and her hair pulled back, and that unpretentious black dress, had eyes that sparkled briefly and that she controlled immediately because she was Clara. And control was the last thing she ever let go of. Alexander crossed the ballroom towards her. The company can survive without me, he told her softly. Alone. My son doesn't have to grow up without his father. Clara looked at him. That was a public declaration at a business gala. Yes. You are absolutely incredible. You told me that once. This time I say it differently. How did she say it differently? With that voice she had when something truly moved her lower than usual. With a warmth that had nothing to do with the ballroom. That's how she said it. And Alexander noticed. Of course. He noticed. This man notices everything when it comes to her. The 3 weeks following the gala were different from everything before. There were no grand gestures. No déclarations. There was something harder to see from the outside and more real when experienced from within. Alexander learning to be present without using power to be present. One Tuesday afternoon, he showed up at the daycare with Clara's permission. He brought nothing, he just stood beside her as Mateo waddled towards them with that clumsy, happy urgency 1-month-olds have when they see something they like. Taking his first steps with all the seriousness in the world. He stayed with him on the sidewalk for 15 minutes, trying to teach him to say data with results the child clearly found more entertaining than definitive. Clara watched them from a few steps back. She didn't intervene. One Thursday, Mateo had a favor. Clara notified Alexander from work with a brief message, asking for nothing. He arrived at her apartment that night with a simple.com pharmacy bag. The correct one, without unnecessary excesses, and stayed until the child fell asleep. He didn't ask if he could stay. He didn't try to turn it into something else. When Mateo finally closed his eyes, Alexander put on his coat and told Clara to call him anytime. She called him that same night at 11, because the fever went up a little. He answered on the second ring. When he arrived, Clara already had it under control. But she opened the door anyway. One Friday, when the previous month's daycare bill threatened to create a problem, Alexander consulted Clara before doing anything. He asked if he could help. She said no. She had it handled. He nodded and didn't mention it again. Not because he didn't want to help, But because he had learned that respecting someone's no without negotiating, it is a form of love that has no elegant name, but weighs more than any check. Clara noticed all of this. She noticed it, without saying, which was her way of processing it. She noticed the difference between the man who fixed faucets without asking and the man who asked before moving. It was the same man, but he was changing in the right direction. And for someone who had decided not to easily believe him again, that was the only thing that could work. Saturday night. Matteo asleep since 8:30. Something that didn't happen with the frequency Clara would have preferred. But that night, for reasons of the process, universe, it did. Alexander was on the living room floor. Not because he had un accident. He was on the floor because that's where he had ended up while trying to assemble the wooden train he had bought for Matteo the week before in an act of optimism that the Swedish instructions had not justified. Clara was on the armchair with her feet tucked up, reading something on her phone. Shoeless. Her hair loose in that way she had when she no longer needed to be presentable to anyone. "You've closed international mergers," she said without looking up. "And you can't assemble a wooden train. Mergers don't come with Swedish instructions. I'll send you the translation app. I already have it. It doesn't help." Clara put down her phone. She looked at him. That man on her living room floor in an outrageously expensive suit, with colorful train pieces scattered around. His hair slightly disheveled because Matteo had run his hand through it before falling asleep and he hadn't bothered to smooth it back. With that expression of concentration he put into assembling a child's toy as much as into leading a shareholder meeting. She felt something in her chest that she no longer wanted to fight. Alexander put down the pieces, stared at the half-assembled train, then looked at her. "Clara. Yes. I don't want to ask you to forget." She lowered her feet from the armchair, looked at him. "I don't want you to erase what happened. I don't want to buy you a second chance. Pause. I want to build something where you never again need to ask permission to exist." Silence. "Alexander. Marry me." The word fell into the living room with the same simplicity as rain. No scene. No production. Just those words. He didn't get up from the floor immediately. He reached into the loose pocket of the jacket that was folded over the armchair and took out a small box. He opened it. A simple ring. A small diamond without ostentation. The kind of ring chosen by someone who understood it wasn't about price. "I bought this almost 2 years ago," he said. "I didn't know when to bring it. I didn't know if it would be possible." A pause. "I was still waiting to deserve the moment." Clara looked at him. "Marry me? Not to give me a child. Not to carry my last name. Not to appease anyone. Marry me because I want to spend the rest of my daughter life defending the peace I should have defended from day one." Silence. "I don't want a pretty promise, Alexander. Then I'll give you an entire lifetime of proof." Clara looked at him. She looked at the ring. Looked at him again. She got off the armchair onto the floor, where he was. She took his face in her hands. "I'm not telling you it doesn't hurt anymore," she whispered. "I'm telling you that for the first time in a long time, I believe you." And then she said, "Yes." A single word. Without speeches. Without additional conditions. Because sometimes When the right answer comes, after all, it costs to get there. All that's needed is that word. He put the ring on her finger, kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that was in no hurry, because it no longer needed to be. The kind of kiss that wasn't a beginning, but a promise of continuity. From the hallway came Mateo's voice. Mama? They both froze. Then they looked at each other. The train, Clara said. So it's assembled when he sees it. Tomorrow. The instructions are in Swedish. I have the translation app. Mama? Mateo repeated with more insistence. Clara got up. At the door. She stopped. Stay. When I put him back to sleep. You help me with the train. Alexander looked at the colorful pieces around him. Then, he genuinely smiled. In a way he didn't use in business meetings. The train was assembled past midnight, with the Swedish instructions conquered and 2 cups of cold tea on the table. And Alexander didn't go back to his apartment that night. He had spent weeks, unable to stop looking at her without his chest feeling heavy. Unable to be 3 feet from her without feeling that that distance was a physical injustice. That night, finally, he didn't have to do any of that. And because, in the best love stories, the final kiss almost always comes with someone small asking for water, a hug, or attention at 9 at night. And because that doesn't ruin it, but completes it. Thus ended the most important night of Alexander Sterling's life. Not in a restaurant with 40 years of history. Not on a terrace overlooking New York City. But on the floor of a small living room with wooden train pieces and 1-month-old son with excellent timing. Epilogue. The wedding was in spring. Not at the Sterling mansion. Not at the Gala Hotel. But at a small estate with a garden an hour from New York City. With the kind of light that only the countryside has in April. There were few people. Clara's mother, who cried even before the ceremony began. Lucy, who wasn't crying but suspiciously blew her nose. Their longtime friends. Some colleagues from the group who had earned the right to be there. The entire Sterling family attended. Eleanor arrived in the right coat and the expression of a woman who has processed things and has reached where she has reached. It wasn't a conversion. She was a woman who, when she lost with grace. She greeted Clara, kissed her on the cheek. Didn't say much. Sometimes you don't have to. Alexander waited at the altar, which was a wooden pergola with white flowers. No marble or red carpet. With Mateo in his arms. Mateo wore a white shirt with a bow that had been perfectly tied until 20 seconds after putting it on. When Clara appeared at the back of the garden, walking alone towards him. Alexander, it didn't try to control himself. Mateo pulled at his untied bow. He let him. Clara arrived. Kissed Mateo on the cheek. Looked at him. The bow. She said softly. I know. He replied. We'll leave it. We'll leave it. In his vows? Alexander said few things. He said he didn't promise he would always do things right. He said he promised to try with everything he had. And he said one last thing, softly, looking directly at her. I promise you will never again be alone in a to room where someone tries to make you feel less. Clara held his gaze as he said, it. She nodded when he finished. Not because she didn't know what to say, but Because sometimes what someone needs to hear, when they finally hear it, requires no response, only reception. And so this story ends. Not with a perfect ending. Because perfect endings are for people who never had to earn them. With a real ending. A small estate in April. An untied bow. A child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's smile. And two people who chose. After all, it cost to choose. What Alexander Sterling learned in that time. He didn't learn in any shareholder meeting. He learned it on a living room floor with wooden train pieces. That there are things that cannot be bought, cannot be managed, cannot be controlled with thermostats. That there are people who enter your world and make it bigger, simply by being who they are. And that when one of those people walks out the door you left open, you have to decide if you are the kind of man who accepts that or the kind of man who learns. He learned late. Silly. With the wrong gift and Swedish instructions. But he learned. And sometimes that's enough to start. If you made it this far, thank you from the bottom of my heart. If this story made you sigh, get a little angry with Alexander, or believe that some people can learn late but truly learn, leave a like and subscribe to the Rection channel. And now tell me in the comments, would you have forgiven Alexander after everything he did?